6 years ago, Hajooj Kuka won the People's Choice Documentary Award at the Toronto International Film Festival. Last week, in his home country of Sudan, he was sentenced to prison. Now we focus on what comes next. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Hajooj Kuka was born in Sudan, raised in the United Arab Emirates, and went to college in the United States. Then he moved back to Sudan, where he's practiced both filmmaking and activism. His film that won the People's Choice Award is called Beats of the Antonov. It chronicles Sudanese rebels in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile who are targeted for aerial bombing by the government of Omar al-Bashir. The Antonov of the film title is the name of the cargo plane the government used for dropping bombs. Hajooj captures harrowing moments of warfare, but the film is balanced by laughter and music. Beats of the Antonov was praised in Variety as, quote, an exemplar of how filmmakers can give dignity to refugees by allowing them their names and their voices, end quote. I met Hajooj in Toronto when his documentary played in 2014, and we've crossed paths in New York in brief encounters. He's a gentle figure with piercing eyes and an easy smile. He described his filmmaking 2 years ago on a podcast for The Guardian.
The power of doing a documentary is the surprise you have when you interview people and they say something and you're like, that's so true. That's my experience. And I didn't realize until I was interviewing somebody and there he's like, yeah, every time there's a bombing, people start laughing. And I was like, oh, that is true. That's what I do, actually. I start laughing. And it's just that joy that I'm still alive. Everybody's still alive. Like, we're still good. We're still good. The way he described it is like, it's like this pain and suddenly there's life again and we'll laugh. We're happy. We're excited about life.
Beats of the Antonov went on to play in the United States on public television's POV series. His more recent film is a work of fiction, an offbeat comedy set in Sudan called Akasha that played at the Venice and Toronto festivals in 2018. Hajooj is a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures that signed on to a statement calling for his release. This comes at a time when Sudan has undergone some positive developments. President al-Bashir was brought down in a coup last year after months of protests, ending his 30-year reign. He's currently being sought by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Sudan is now run by a transitional government that has moved away from the hardline Islamicist tendencies that were once more prevalent. So it was unsettling in August when Hajooj and other artists were arrested on dubious charges over disturbing the peace in Khartoum. It was more shocking on September 17th when Hajooj and 4 colleagues were sentenced to 2 months in prison without bail. Now they await an appeals process that could take another week or more. My guest on this episode is Steven Markovits. He's a South African producer who's brought many African directors to international attention through his company Big World Cinema. His roster includes Hajooj. I reached Steven at his home outside of Cape Town 4 days after Hajooj went to prison. I started by asking Steven to talk about Beats of the Antonov.
I think what Hajooj, his main thing was that he was making a documentary about a war, but he didn't want to make a depressing film. In terms of the narrative of Africa, there have been so many films made about, oh, look what a mess it is, and people look so sad, and that he wanted to make a film which countered that narrative. And so while the people were being bombed and persecuted, they were actually celebrating their culture and their music and finding strength through that. So it was very much a reclaiming of their cultures as opposed to just being victims of oppression and war.
And can you talk about his character? What are the things that, as you got to know him, made you want to invest your time in supporting him?
Well, Hajooj is a unique individual. He is very zen, very calm, very much knows what he wants, very respectful, has really kind of got his ego in check. He's a very he's quite an evolved soul, and I've very seldom come across filmmakers who are so at peace with themselves. I mean, we all, as filmmakers, we often carry a lot of neurosis with us. And Hajooj has worked through a lot of that. So, he's someone, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he's a vegan, he does yoga, meditation. Some people call him a Sudanese hippie. I think that's a bit simplistic. But he's that kind of person, and he's incredibly committed to bringing about democracy in Sudan, and has been an activist for many years. And he was very quiet about it, but it turns out, he's one of the leaders of a non-violent youth movement, which has hundreds of thousands of members, and played a key role in overthrowing al-Bashir. So he's an incredibly principled activist also.
So for people who don't follow what's happening in Sudan, maybe they know that the leader, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown last year in 2019 in a coup. Can you fill in the backdrop of what's been going on in the last year, and what kind of activities Hajooj and his movement have been focused on?
Well, I think what's interesting about what happened in Sudan is, next year is the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. And if we look at how most situations turned out in countries, they often turned to violence and ended up often worse off than they were before. Whereas I think Sudan was quite unique because there was a non-violent, peaceful revolution. There was some, the al-Bashir regime did kill quite a few people, but it was not on the scale of a mass civil war. So they managed to have a relatively peaceful transition, and there now is a civilian government in coalition with the military as a transitional government for 2 years. And the idea is within those 2 years to have a democratic election to bring about like a new dispensation in the country. Hajooj and his groups played, his group and other groups in Sudan played an instrumental role in bringing down al-Bashir by having mass protests, and they occupied a square for a considerable period of time and kind of set up an alternative vision of Sudan. They had a hospital, they had food, they had social workers, kind of set up how young people, mainly young people, would like society to be. And it ended up eventually al-Bashir sent in the military and attacked the square, and a number of people died. Hajooj was beaten up. He had head injuries. He lost all his equipment, all his hard drives. And then he, on the 30th of June last year, he had this idea that, it was actually the 30th anniversary of al-Bashir coming to power. And he had this idea of like having a mass protest, even at the time when everyone was scared, and they built up enough courage to come out on the streets. And that event was a turning point in bringing down the al-Bashir regime.
Let me go to the incident that took place last month in August that precipitated this case that has landed him in prison now. Can you describe what was going on last August?
Sure, yeah. Hajooj, with a number of people, formed a group called Civic Lab, which was doing kind of civic work as well as theater workshops. And they rented a space and were doing rehearsals in the space. And then some of the local Islamists stopped them and attacked them and called the police, the police basically didn't intervene when they were being attacked. And it seems like, it hasn't been said, but it seems like the main reason that their rehearsal was broken up was that it was not men's only. There were women and men participating in that, and that created the real tension. They were then taken to prison, and in the prison, the one female artist who was arrested was beaten up in front of everyone by a policeman, and that created incredible tension, and she was knocked to the ground, and the other artists, including hajooj, tried to intervene to protect her, and then they started singing songs, and then they were charged with disturbing the peace in a police station. That was the charge against them. They got bail, and they split the groups up into a group of 5, which includes hajooj, and there's another group of 6 artists who are facing trial on Thursday this week. And they've appeared in court 5 or 6 times, and normally something like this might be carried with a fine or something like that, and much to their shock, the judge sentenced them to 2 months in prison, which they are now appealing through the courts.
So when this went to trial last week and this sentence came down, it was not what anyone expected.
No, it was totally unexpected. The lawyers were very confident that they would get off and that there wasn't really a case. And it seems like there has been, there are factions within the government who are orchestrating this, and there are other factions who would support hajooj and his artists. So, with transitional governments, it's often quite a messy process, and you kind of have this coalition of forces pushing and pulling. And I think what's happened here is hajooj and his artists have got caught up in that dynamic.
There was a report that hajooj had been beaten in prison. Can you describe what you understand of that situation?
Yeah, what happened is, I think it was the first day they were moved to prison. Firstly, they were sentenced and they were not given the option of bail. So they were taken straight to prison. And in the prison, hajooj was beaten by some of the guards, and they cut off some of his dreadlocks. As you know, you've met hajooj, he's got dreadlocks down to his ankles. They cut off some of his dreadlocks, and he was beaten. And what happened is we got that news out quite quickly, and there was quite a big outcry, and that information got to the government. And what's happened now is the national head of prisons went to the prison and has now based himself at this prison and has changed the conditions of all prisoners in that prison to improve conditions in a far more equitable way. And so, in fact, what hajooj went through has led to an improvement of the conditions in the prison.
Can you describe the movement that's happening now to calling for the release of hajooj and the other 4 artists?
Well, at the moment, we're getting, there's a lot of support around this cause, and we've seen a lot of major festivals signing up to support this. Sundance, Toronto, Berlin, Venice, IDFA, and various other festivals and institutions have signed onto this. And we also know a number of foreign governments have also approached the Sudanese government around this. And we also saw an amazing gesture by Cameron Bailey in Toronto, where in the middle of the festival, towards right at the end of the festival, Cameron decided to show both Beats of the Antonov and Akasha at Toronto as an act of solidarity. And so at the moment, there are people from all quarters approaching us who want to help. And I think it's important, I was talking this morning with the activist group who hajooj is working with about the case. And it's important to note the position that hajooj and the artists are taking is that they want justice. It's not as simple as them being freed. They want justice. They want to take this through the courts, and they want to win the case because they feel that if they just get let out of prison and get amnesty. Because there's a lot of attention on their case, that's obviously going to be seen as the reason they got out. But the average person who's being sent to jail, often unjustly, will not have that luxury. So they want the court to acknowledge that these charges must be dropped, and for the court, they want to win the appeal to try and get the justice system working in the country.
You described the period of transitional government in Sudan with different factions. Do you have any indication that international pressure on this case is meaningful to people who can make a difference in the case?
Definitely. I think just the example of the way the director of prisons went there and improved prison conditions, that was a direct result of global pressure on the Sudanese government. And I think what you got to remember is that this government has taken over from an incredibly brutal regime, and they've really determined to change the image of Sudan. At the moment, they're trying to get ambassadors recognized. They're trying to improve the human rights record. They're trying to change the image of Sudan. And there are a lot of good progressive people who are working on that. So I think the government is incredibly sensitive to outside criticism because they don't want to be seen as associated with the previous regime. They want to make a clean break from that. So I think there is definitely, the government is feeling the pressure every day.
So in some of the local reporting I've read about the case, it indicates that there's one mood in the national government, but within the judicial system, there are holdovers from the previous regime with a more of an Islamist bent, and that is part of the explanation for why these artists got a harsh sentence, even though there are other factions in the government that may not want to be so harsh.
That's absolutely the case. I think I'd add a third faction, and that would be the military itself, which has its own power base that it's trying to build. So there's a big faction of people who were part of the previous regime. There's the new civilian government, mainly at the top, but throughout the kind of echelons of the state apparatus, it still is pretty much the same people who were part of the al-Bashir regime. So there's a real tension between those three factions.
I'm curious, was hajooj working on any new films?
Yes, we're busy developing 2 films together, 2 feature films. He's also working on a smaller documentary on the side, but he's in active development on 2 feature films. But, when the revolution started, he was very much like, now I'm an activist, I'll come back to being a filmmaker. So I've been sitting around waiting for him to overthrow the regime, and then we can get on with making films again.
While we're talking about hajooj, I want to ask you about your wider work in producing films from Africa. Here in North America, we've seen a trickle of films coming from African directors that may be a trickle, but it's more than we would have seen 10 or more years ago. I think of this year at the Sundance Film Festival, there was the film Softy from Kenya. Just last week at the Toronto Film Festival from Congo was Diodo Hamadi's film, Downstream to Kinshasa. Last year at the Berlin Film Festival, there was another film from Sudan that won the top documentary prize, talking about trees. Can you just describe what's been happening in Africa that's been allowing more homegrown cinema?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting phase that African film is entering into, and it is quite hard to generalize because there obviously is specific dynamics in each country, and some countries are producing a lot more than others. But I think a couple of things have happened is that what I'm seeing is that the current generation of filmmakers are now one or often two generations from the kind of colonial era. And so they don't have the kind of issues that their parents had, or the filmmakers from the 70s and 80s and 90s who were very much reacting to the fall of colonialism and the beginning of these new countries. They kind of, in a way, are much more kind of global in their thinking, but also I find an incredible sense of kind of connection to their culture and localizing things, almost a reaction against, the kind of cultural domination of America and Europe on Africa for so many years. And at the same time, I think I've been producing now for 25 years, I think I've never seen this much interest in African cinema as I do at the moment. And I think specifically from the United States, there's a lot more interest than there was before. And I think also what's happening is what I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years is quite a few African-based film funds popping up, which are supporting local filmmakers. And I think it's giving a lot more power to African filmmakers, and that kind of imbalance that's always been there is starting to shift. Because, if you look at the history of African cinema over the last 50, 60 years, you would see the majority of those films are owned by Europe. And I think there's now beginning to be a shift in the ownership patterns, which I think is impacting on the kind of films that are being made. So I think it's still tough. It still takes a long time to get films made. Some films are still unrealized. But I think more and more we're seeing far more developed and polished films and films that can work both locally and have a global audience. So I'm feeling very positive about the current situation.
Right now, it's been a few days since Hajooj has been in prison. Every day there's kind of more attention being brought to it. What's your personal feeling about how this is going to go?
I think it's a precedent-setting case in the New Sudan. I don't think there's been anything like this in the New Sudan, and I think it's a test of this new coalition government, how they handle this. My feeling is I'd be very surprised if they don't win the appeal. I think it's most likely they're going to win the appeal, and it will set a precedent on how people are dealt with by the police and the judicial system. I don't think one case will change things overnight, but I think given the attention this case has got, I think there's a really good chance this can start helping to shift that dynamic between these three factions in the country and bring about a more equitable way of dealing with justice and in the country. So I'm feeling optimistic that there will be a positive outcome to this.
I want to thank Stephen Markovitz for speaking with me. You can check our show notes to follow Stephen on Twitter and monitor the latest developments for Hajooj Kuka. Thanks to the International Coalition for Filmmakers at Risk and all the other individuals working to free Hajooj and his colleagues. You can join those efforts using the hashtag #ReleaseTheArtistSudan. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.